welcome to the Cārvāka podcast. This is your host Kushal Mehra. All right, today's podcast is about a recently published working paper called Global Perception Indices. I'll read the whole title: Why India Does Poorly on Global Perception Indices. Case study of three opinion-based indices: Freedom in the World Index, EIU Democracy Index, and Variety of Democracy Indices. It was authored by Sanjeev Sanyal and Akansha Arora. And to talk about that paper, I have Sanjeev Sanyal on the podcast. Sanjeev, thank you so much for coming. And first of all, before everybody, I just have to clarify. भाई मेरे को बहुत लोगों ने ईमेल करके बोला था कि आपने कुशल संजीव has never made it on the podcast. So finally, thanks a lot for coming on the podcast. At least we have crossed the bridge over there.
So thank you for having me on your show. For whatever reason, it didn't work out earlier, but hopefully I will now do more than one so that we make up for lost time.
All right, so Sanjeev, let's start with this paper itself. Like when we talk about indices, maybe we can start with a brief background as to what is the role of these different indices that they do, and why are they important in the sense, because I remember very specifically in the paper where you start the paper by saying you could ignore it too, but it's ideal not to ignore them, right? That's mentioned in the paper itself. So can you explain to everyone what these papers actually, like what these indices talk about?
So as many of you may have been seeing in the press recently and over the recent years, that there are all these indices on soft factors. So things like freedom of press or academic freedom or democracy and all kinds of other happiness and so other fuzzy things. I'm not saying they're not important. I'm just pointing out to you that most of these topics are fuzzy and subjective, and important as they may well be. But in order to quantify them, a lot of effort has been put in by a bunch of mainly Western think tanks in recent years in order to try and quantify them. Now, some of these go back some decades, but this has clearly become more important in the last decade or so. Now, historically, India always did poorly in them, by the way. So it's not new that we have done poorly in them, but there has been something quite suspicious going on recently, in that particularly since 2014 and even more so since 2019, where India's index rankings and scores, by the way, they're slightly different. One is ranking, the other is score. In both of them, India's rankings and scores have dipped quite strongly in recent years. Now, the question is, why has this happened? So let me give you a flavor of some of these. There is an index which Swedish-based think tank called VDEM, I think, produces, which is on academic freedom. It just came out 2-3 weeks ago. And in that index, interestingly, India scores not just below Pakistan, but even below Afghanistan. Just think about it. So academic freedom in India is below Taliban-ruled Afghanistan. So let me tell you where our ranking is. Our ranking is in the bottom but one decile, which is basically the bottom, between the 80th and 90th decile. Okay, and Afghanistan and Pakistan are in the I think, if I'm not mistaken, they're in the 60th to 70th decile. Now, the reason I'm pointing this out to you is we are in the same league as the likes of Yemen, for example, or other war-torn countries. And as I mentioned, worse than Taliban-controlled Afghanistan. Now, clearly, there is some problem with this. Now, this has also happened in the past. Another index that very recently came out on press freedom, I think it came out just a few hours ago, if I'm not mistaken. Out of 180 countries, we are at 150. Okay, and roughly the same league as the likes of, again, war-torn countries like Libya, and so on. So, point is, there's clearly a problem. Now, historically, we ignored it. Even after our rankings went further down, we continued to ignore it, saying that, look, what we really care about is concrete things like GDP or whatever. But the problem is that if we continue to ignore them, we also don't take into account the fact that many of these things indirectly have concrete impact on us. So let me give you some examples of this. So the three indices which I used in my paper, which is the EIU index, the Freedom House index, and the VDEM index, and there are lots of sub indices in them as well. Now, these indices and sub indices are utilized by the World Bank's World Governance Indicators. Okay. Now, this World Governance Indicators then find its way into our sovereign ratings. In fact, we did some research when I was in finance ministry onto our sovereign ratings, and we discovered that between 18 to 20% of our sovereign rating is driven by these world governance indices. Okay. Now, obviously, it has a concrete impact. Quite apart from, of course, the fuzzier sort of impact that it may have on our global standing and so on. But real concrete impact. Now, this is not just there. In addition to that, what is happening is that this kind of approach to taking these fuzzy things into account is gathering steam worldwide. There's something called the ESG, which is Environmental Social Governance Indicators, which are increasingly being encouraged by mostly by various kinds of NGO type interest groups to be included into concrete things like investment decisions by funds, by MNCs, and so on. Now, again, while they haven't fully been implemented yet, but do remember that as and when they do get implemented, they will become a part of the decision-making companies of multinational companies, of large pension funds globally, and so on. And there is every likelihood that the same think tanks will then issue these sort of ESG rankings based on a similar kind of framework, and we will become effectively a prisoner of this complex network of ESG requirements. We run entirely opaquely by these non-accountable, non-transparent bodies. So I think there is every case of us pushing back. Otherwise, what is happening is that India, and of course much of the global south, will effectively end up being colonized again, this time not through by the sword, but by the pen.
Now, this bit I want to talk about, because this whole idea of colonization is something that I was also worried about. And आपने इसके बारे में actually social media पे भी you had spoken about, and I remember I think it was on an interview also you had spoken about this. Now let us focus on this. How is this new form of colonization working? And why the let's say if I try to present the other side of the argument and try to push back so that there are more robust answers, that no, this is not colonization, there are certain standards, there are global standards, we are living in a global standard based world, so why is this colonizing someone?
Well, if that was the case, then you would say that these kinds of indices would be produced by a wide array of people. And then when they did produce it, it would be based on a wide array of opinion and so on. That is not the case at all. Almost all of these indicators are produced from a very tiny number of places, essentially from the North Atlantic. A bunch of them are from the US. There are some UK-based ones and some Nordic ones. You won't even get one from the West, as in coming from Spain or Greece or Poland. Okay, there's some Nordic countries will have. There will be France and UK, maybe Germany, and the US. That is basically the where all these think tanks are based. They are not even based in sort of developed countries which are not in that part of the world. So that you won't see the Singapore or Japan or South Korea's opinion being asked. In any case, why should only the developed world have these opinions? What about developing countries? Why aren't there any Indian think tanks in there? Or I mean, maybe you don't trust non-democracies, but what about democracies? And so basically what happens here is that an extremely small sliver of countries control the narrative. Then when they do try to supposedly do what they would claim to be objective assessments, do remember how they are doing this. They are essentially basing it on tiny numbers of people. So I discovered in the three indices, I discovered that between 4 to 6 experts' opinions are taken. Now, who are these experts is not told to us. Where do they live? What is the basis of the expertise? Nothing is told to us. Just random, it's basically, what would you think of an opinion poll of a country of our size if you based it on opinions of six people? I mean, wouldn't you laugh at it if you had an election opinion poll based on a survey of six people for Delhi municipal election? Right now, if that is the case, how are you basing it on the opinions of six people? Who are these six people? And even more absurdly, how are you doing cross country analysis? Because when you're ranking countries, those people don't only have to know about that country that they are ranking on, they have to be able to rank other countries in order to know where in the list it goes. So the entirely opaque systems are used in all of this. Now, one of these guys, the EIU, claims to be doing also some wider surveys. Now, we looked into this as well, and then we discovered that the survey for India has not been done since 2012. So just think about the sheer complete absurdity of how we are all being ranked. They're not even doing the little bit of wider surveying they were supposed to do, even if you accept that these subjective things can be worked out through opinions and so on. And there are lots of problems with how you translate these questions, etc. But even if you accept their methodology, they are not being true to it themselves.
One disturbing aspect in the paper that stood out for me, जो आपने लिखा था in this in the freedom in the world index, was that, and I'm quoting from the report itself, your essay, paper itself, that the report considers Jammu and Kashmir as a separate territory from India and gives it separate ranking since 1990. As per the latest report, territory of Jammu and Kashmir is considered as not free. I mean, how can India as a nation then, actually, my first question is, don't you think then we should not be taking these people seriously at all, in that sense that they are even questioning the territorial integrity of our nation?
So there is serious issues with this. As you point out, that we don't. But the problem, as I said right in the beginning, is not about us taking it seriously. See, if you do not rise up and begin questioning their methodology, this is beginning to infect things that affect us. So, for example, Freedom House, that's the one you are quoting, it doesn't even consider Jammu and Kashmir as part of India, and it issues a separate report on this. And this same Freedom House, incidentally, is also going around ranking the likes of North Cyprus, which is, by the way, under occupation by the Turks. And you will be amused to know that mm, uh, in the rankings of democracy that some of these indices do, North Cyprus is actually ranked above us in one or two of these indices. Now, let me just point out where North Cyprus is, because some of the audience may not be aware of this. Now, Cyprus is an island in the Eastern Mediterranean. Its majority population is Greek, but somewhere in the 50s or 60s, I forget exactly when, maybe it was the 70s, somewhere several decades ago, Turkey invaded Cyprus and took over the northern one-third of it. And it kicked out all the Greek Cypriots and basically set up a client state there. This northern Cyprus is incidentally not recognized by the UN or any other country other than Turkey. Okay, it is also incidentally carried out ethnic cleansing, because it's thrown out its entire Greek population from there. This place is ranked, ironically, higher than India on the democracy index. So, I mean, what credibility can it have? So, I mean, absolutely none. However, here comes the point. Our old approach was just ignore this. They don't matter, etc. But as I'm pointing out to you, you have to care what they do, because effectively what is happening is that they are indirectly influencing concrete things like our sovereign ratings. And if we do not push back, these same think tanks will create other indices, which will have other, like the ESG indices or other things, which will then end up impacting us. So I think if we do not push back now, we will end up ending up in a new form of colonization, where our global narrative will be and our global standing and actual concrete things like trade and investment will be impacted significantly by this web of opinion based and clearly agenda driven rankings.
Another thing that I found very disturbing right after you have mentioned this point was in the it's at the end of page 10 of the PDF and start of page 11, where you say the report notes that, quote, Muslim candidates notably won 27 of 545 seats in the 2019 Lok Sabha elections, up from 22 previously. However, and this is where I add the kahani mein twist bit, and this just blew my mind away that they actually twisted the report like this. And I'm reading again. However, this amounted to just 5% of the seats in the chamber, whereas Muslims make up some 14% of the population. Note that the number of seats, after that you have written, number of seats have increased over the years, so it's not clear how the situation has worsened over time. Now I want to connect this to a larger question. Now we enter, as you have clearly beautifully mentioned in the entire analysis, that there are objective parameters and then there are subjective parameters. And what a lot of these reports rely on are vague questions, and which are so subjective that it can be, interpreted anyway. And already social science has a replication problem, where I think it was in the field of psychology that more than 50% of actual real world claims made in social sciences and psychology are not being replicated to. In such a larger pressure on social sciences as a subject, if you have things like these, so my question to you is that when you have these kinds of rating based on, I don't want to use the word unscientific because I'm careful here, but on irresponsible metrics, then how do we explain to the world at large that these measurements itself are irresponsible?
So there are serious problems with the questionnaires they're using. As I said, first of all, those questionnaires only go to some 4 to 6 people, supposed experts. Who, we are not told who those experts are. But even if we assumed that those experts were genuine experts and they were doing their job unbiased, etc., a strong assumption, incidentally. But nevertheless, let's say they were doing that. Even then, the questionnaires themselves are bizarre. And there are different kinds of problems. So, one kind of problem, let me start. There are 3 kinds of broad problems, but let me take you through them one by one. One of the problems is that they ask questions which are so generic that even if you and I agreed on something, we will end up actually marking them on the scale in different ways. So, for example, let provide a question like, "Is your society corrupt?" or something like that. Okay. Now, even if we agreed that on the level of corruption that India had, if I asked you to rank it on a scale of 10 to 0, very likely we are going to give very different scores, because these are things, it's a completely, how do you score something like, is your country corrupt? Is corruption a major problem or something like that? Now, not only are individual countries, it's impossible to put a number to this. Now you are asking different countries to mark them as well. So somebody sitting in Nigeria is being asked the same question. Somebody sitting in Australia is being asked the same question. And, so how are these all comparable? It depends on lots of things, how strict that person's perceptions are, what are his or her expectations about the world, what are they comparing it as being the ideal, who knows? So, first of all, some of these subjective things are just so subjective that you can't have a meaningful numerical number to it that is comparable cross country. So, there's one problem. Then there are questions that are clearly inappropriate to the context. So, example, there is one sub-index in which India gets 0. Okay. So, how does it get 0? Because the sub-index is on direct democracy. Now, obviously, direct democracy is a meaningful thing if you're a small European country like Switzerland, where direct democracy, you can go to your whatever, you can directly do referendums. Now, India obviously is not going to do direct referendums on things too often. So we have to rely on indirect forms of democracy by definition. So India gets 0 on this. Switzerland is, by the way, the highest scoring country on this basis. But what is extraordinary is that you have countries like Cuba and Afghanistan again popping up and actually scoring something. They score 0.2 on this. We score 0. I think Switzerland scores 0.69, and Cuba and Afghanistan score zero point 0.2. Now, that's nuts. I mean, how on earth are these countries even remotely democratic? Forget about being direct democracies, right? So, that is another kind of thing where questions are inappropriate for a large country. And then also, even within there, you get these largely absurd answers. And then there are a third class of problems where the type of questions you asked that are not asked. So, supposing you are asking about democracy. Now, an obvious question that you would like to ask in that context is your head of state elected? Right? It should be a Raj, I don't think too many people would say that that is not a part of the democratic setup, whether or not your head of state is democratically elected. Now, it turns out that this question is not asked. Why is it not asked? Well, if you did ask it, then a very large number of countries would get very low marks or zero on that. For example, all the constitutional monarchies in the Nordic countries, the United Kingdom, the Benelux countries, Spain, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, I could go on. The point is, there are large, on all these countries, by the way, are very high up in the democracy index, because that's because you define democracy in a particular way. Now, if you have defined democracy in a particular way, then then basically, in fact, one of the funny things about democracy, the index, is that almost all the top spots are taken by constitutional monarchies. There are very few republics in there. In fact, the result of the democracy index is that being a republic is a bad thing for democracy. Uh, so you get these completely ridiculous outcomes, and we are supposed to not question them at all. So I think it's important to push back against the methodology. Now, there are people like Salvatore Baboris, who's a professor in Australia, who have raised a lot of questions about the inputs that go into these, and particularly the opinions of various uh, uh, experts that are being used. And his view is that Indians let themselves down. Indian intellectuals are providing obviously tilted and biased views. He's right, but I think he is being way too kind to the methodology. He's not. He is almost assuming that these methodologies are actually acceptable methodologies. Therefore, I have a somewhat different view from him. My view is, yes, there is a lot of biases in what the Indian so-called experts are giving in, but I think the methodologies themselves stink. And even if we end up with reasonable experts on India, we would still end up looking bad because of the way the methodologies are set up. So I think, if we want to push back against colonization of this kind, we've got to begin questioning methodology as well, because otherwise we are becoming subservient to a narrative and a framework that is clearly being set up in a way that is prejudices against us right in the beginning, even before the game starts.
I couldn't agree more with you, because, in fact, when Salvatore had come on the podcast, I did raise this problem with him, and I said, you're being too charitable to these organizations. And in fact, I'll pull your paper up itself on the screen to make your point even better. Like, just look at these questions. Like, I had to mark number 3. I mean, what does this even mean? Extent to which adult population shows an interest in and follows politics in the news. I mean, ये किस किस्म का standard है यार? I mean, imagine if somebody says me, I don't like politics, is too negative. I just want to watch cricket or football or whatever sport I like to watch. It is almost as if that country is a problem. And secondly, I don't know if they ever consider this as a factor. Voting percentages. India, on average, Sanjeev, you also know that, has a very high participation of people in terms of people who go out and actually vote during an election, whether it's Lok Sabha, whether it's Vidhan Sabha, whether it's a municipal election or Gram Panchayat elections. Indians do go out and vote a lot. So, isn't that also a factor when we calculate these kinds of like what is the bottom line at the end of the day? How enthusiastic are people in terms of how much they want to participate in the dance of democracy? And the only gauge where we can gauge it is voting percentage. In fact, if we look at the Western world, leave Australia, which has compulsory voting because they don't have a choice, they have to go and vote. I mean, doesn't this matter? And in fact, India should rate much higher, be rated much higher than most Western countries, which have abysmally low voting percentages.
Absolutely. In fact, how can you even say that Indians are not interested in politics? Go to any chai dukan anywhere in the country, sit there and look at what the politics is being discussed. The problem is even in the way they define what news is. You see, I may be very interested in my RWA politics. Is that not politics? I mean, I don't know. Is it only about electoral politics? I may be very interested in my panchayat politics, but not interested in my state politics. All kind. I may be interested in national politics. I don't care about my state politics. All kinds of combinations and permutations will be there, and that is what democracy is about: allowing people to take on whatever it is they think matters in their life. So I think these kind, the whole thing is utterly laughable. I wouldn't have bothered to go in there and spend my time on writing this paper, but for the fact that I noticed that beyond just fuzzy impressions that it may be impacting, it is now it has an impact on things for some time, on things like sovereign ratings. But now this business of ESGs is important, and the other thing that really irritated me is in many of these indices, incidentally, India's current rankings are as bad as they were under emergency. So, I mean, this is completely nuts. I mean, how could you even imagine the restrictions placed on Indian freedoms during, say, COVID? And by the way, those have been long lifted now. And compare them to those political restrictions that you had during emergency. Number one. Number two, those kinds of restrictions were widely placed across the world. How is India different? And in fact, if anything, a responsible government and a democratic responsible government would have placed some restrictions during COVID. So, I mean, I simply boggles my mind how we would have ended up being ranked at an emergency level of loss of freedom during for restrictions put during COVID. And as I mentioned, every other sensible country in the world did it. Many of those, incidentally, who do these indices are ironically in favor of all kinds of things like vaccine mandates, which some people may argue is not, democratic at all. So, point I'm making is these are fuzzy things, and we wouldn't have bothered about them at all, but for the fact that they actually have concrete impact.
Talking about fuzzy, let us look at this. Is there media bias against opposition parties or candidates? How can this be part of something that is calculating any kind of
No, no, even
objective
if it was
standard?
there, how do you put numbers to this?
I don't know. That's what I got shocked when I read this paper. And जब आपने ये सब share किया, and then the next one, of the major print and broadcast outlets, how many routinely criticize the government? I don't know
Boss,
what to say.
in India, though, you look at it every other day as how evil the government is, whether it's state or central level. I mean, we've got literally the most noisy press there ever is. And in fact, the complaint usually is that the noisy ones are the ones that are pro-government. You've got to be kidding me. Why are they noisy? If everybody agreed, it would be rather quiet, wouldn't it? It would become like Doordarshan.
Yeah, and this is what
particularly
disappoints
Doordarshan of the
me.
19 particularly Doordarshan of the 1980s, where of course everybody agreed because everybody on the screen was well paid for by the state. So if you have a very quiet and uh, media, particularly television media, and if your debates are all very quiet, the likelihood is that you are North Korea.
Now, what scares me the most is, and I know you have mentioned it, but I still want to talk a little bit more about this, is this whole methodology that they use. The methodology, the devil always lies in the details. Now, I noticed this even, and by the way, I know in social science research, this is a very common practice where newspaper articles are culled out and are used as a larger standard to gauge what's happening in society. So I'm aware of that. It's not that I'm not aware. But what happens is, like, I always say this to my friends outside India, especially in America, Canada, or England. I tell them India is literally two worlds. If you read English papers, something is happening which is on one side of the field. And then if you read regional language newspapers, let's say for example Hindi, you will think India is a completely different country, and these are just left at the discretion of the editor of what they pick. And obviously, whether people like it or not, these are business houses too. They are running a business, so they are only going to publish things which they assume their viewers or readers are going to like and consume. So it is also market driven. Now, most of these surveys, from what I have understood, I read one paper, that was that French World Press Freedom Index. So I actually did the torture of going through that one. I read their entire questionnaire and everything. So what I realized, that a lot of these people, they only rely on English news outlets. And English news outlets, anybody who's even a 4 saal ka bacha will know that English news outlets lean in a particular way ideologically. Now after that, if they only seek, don't, I mean, isn't there a complete sampling bias itself?
Absolutely. And so here is the thing. Um, there is a problem here, obviously, with India's old elite, which basically is largely English speaking, descended from the old British collaborator class, and their sort of a worldview, which has dominated to a large extent India's intellectual life till the last decade or so. This English speaking collaborator class has historically not only tilted in a particular way, but they have also had these well established multi generational linkages with global academia, global publishing houses, think tanks, and so on. And so, therefore, a certain kind of narrative is continuously fed at that level. Now, if there were genuine researchers, and it doesn't require genius to know that this sort of thing is going on, they would obviously reach out past the English language and also past the certain social class to find out what the wider world thinks. And clearly, no effort in that direction has been made at all. So I think this is a rather absurd situation. And do remember that in India, the ruling party continuously loses elections. I mean, in the last uh, couple of weeks, the national ruling party lost, the municipal election in Delhi, which was deemed to be very important by some people, and then also a state election in Himachal. So clearly, that if it was so one-sided and India was 150th in press freedom and so on, that is not the circumstances you would expect to see.
Now, this quote bothered me the most in the entire paper, and I'm reading it from the paper. And this is a direct quote from a report. Again, the overall freedom and fairness of elections free and fair, also was hard hit with the last elections held under Prime Minister Modi's reign in 2019, precipitating a downgrading to an electoral autocracy. अभी मैं तुमको हिंदी में बोल रहा हूँ, इनको शर्म भी नहीं आई ऐसी चीज बोलने में.
No, no. So electoral autocracy means what? I mean, that is the most stunning part of it. If it is by definition, election is about the majority electing somebody. If it is whatever does it mean? They had to actually invent a completely new oxymoron to be able to express this. So, I mean, the utter absurdity of some of the things they are trying to push through is ridiculous. That's all I have to say. And because they even with their biased subjective frameworks, when they're unable to push back, they have to invent completely new frameworks like electoral autocracy, because it's obvious that they've already decided what is which box you want have to put you in, and then if it doesn't fit, you just relabel, change the label on the box till it works to serve their agenda.
And you know what hurts the most is, like, I literally, ek mahina new I have come back from North America. आई हैव सीन उधर अभी मिड टर्म इलेक्शन जो है उधर, पता नहीं उनकी काउंटिंग ही नहीं खत्म होती, पता खत्म ही नहीं होती, चलती रहती है चलती रहती है। और यहाँ पे 3 अलग अलग इलेक्शन हुए हैं, इतनी जल्दी काउंटिंग हुई है। द ट्रांसफर ऑफ पावर फ्रॉम वन आउटफिट टू द अदर हैज बीन सो स्मूथ इन इंडिया, एंड इन स्पाइट ऑफ दैट, आई मीन, एक होती है हमारी लिव्ड रियलिटी जो हम देख रहे हैं। नोबडी हियर इज सेइंग इंडिया इज सम परफेक्ट, paradise. Nobody is making that point. But when I read something like this, I'm like, yeah, it's so hard to even take these things seriously. Before I take a few questions, I just had one last thing. I have to ask you this. When you actually read these three indices or rankings, what was your first reaction?
No, I knew to start with that there was something absurd. I mean, I'm not in the political science space, but I am an economist and I work in with data all the time. So I don't have to, I know even before I've gotten into it that there was something utterly absurd about it. I had not applied my mind to a great extent to this before, because this is not my space really. I'm more looking at finance and national accounts and external accounts and stuff like that, exchange rates and things like that. So those are more my area. So I don't really delve into these fuzzy socio-political type of indicators as part of my job. But I do deal enough with data all the time that I can tell that there's something fishy about the whole thing even before I got into it. So, as I said, the only reason I really began to take it seriously because this began to nudge against things I get involved in, like sovereign ratings, for example. Right? It's a sovereign ratings is a hard thing. It has impact on the cost of our cost of borrowing. It has impact on the way investments flow into this country, our global standing, and so on and so forth. These are concrete things which um, uh, when I was as the principal economic advisor and now as economic advisor to the prime minister, I have to deal with this. So I began to see this appearing, these fuzzy things appearing at the edges. So, I assumed that maybe the World Bank does its due diligence and so on. But as these numbers continue to become worse and worse, I began to say, okay, let me go and look at what is actually going on here. And so when I began digging these up, I found all these ridiculous things. But let me tell you, there is actually a similar bias that is there also in the hard data based indices as well. This paper does not get into it, but I will give you some examples of how, even in some things which are supposedly based on hard data, there's something very fishy about the way it is the Indian indices, anything related to India pops up in international indicators. And let me take one indicator of that, which is the HDI, which is the Human Development Index. It's a fairly widely used index. It's not an uncommon index. And in there, it's quite interesting that India's ranking has basically been flat for many, many years. I mean, for a long time. Now, clearly, our quality of life has gone up. I mean, India of 30 years ago was quite different from what it is today. Now, you may argue, okay, it's a ranking. Other countries have improved. Now, that is a little shaky because our share of global GDP and our level as part of the Indian per capita income as part as a share of global per capita income has gone up. So that's a bit shaky. But even then, even our scores were at least going up, even if they were going up slowly. But in the last 1 or 2 years, they've actually gone down. So not only has our ranking gone down a little bit, our score, actually absolute score, has also gone down. So I got into this and I wrote an article about this also in Times of India about a month and a half or two ago. I think it was in November I wrote it. And in there, it's again very interesting what you find. So the Human Development Index is made up of three bits. One is on human capital, which is mostly data relating to schooling. There is the per capita GDP as calculated in PPP by the World Bank. And there's a third category, which is on life expectancy at birth. Okay. Now, World Bank, PPP, let's leave it aside. That's, we can quibble about it, but broadly, I think it's where most people agree it should be. The schooling also has a problem with the data. I won't get into it because that's more complicated. But let me explain the one where the biggest anomaly is, and it's rather simple to understand also. So it turns out that India, till COVID hit us, had a life expectancy at birth of 70.1, i.e., a child born in 2019, an Indian child was expected to live to 70 years of age. Okay, fine. We all accept this. I'm not disputing this at all. Now, what happens is that this number is cut by 3 years. 3 years in the latest report in 2022. In other words, an Indian is now expected to be living only till 67 years. Now, let me tell you why this is an absurd calculation. Remember, first of all, there's a conceptual problem. Because you see, a child born today, or rather, even in the middle of the Delta wave, let's say, that child was not going to be affected by COVID. Almost everything suggests that children are not affected by COVID very much. So, by saying that this child's life expectancy at birth is being impacted, what they are basically saying is that for the next 20 years, when he reaches adulthood, when COVID will begin to impact him, we will still have this COVID pandemic going on. Right? So, first of all, that's completely conceptually a wrong idea, number one. Number two, what they did here was even more fishy. They basically then took these numbers from a model of how much they thought was the number of excess deaths India had. Now, this was completely based on something very, very fishy, based not on any data that we provided or even surveys that they did. It was based on a model, which is basically something pulled out of thin air, which we had disputed when those data had come out. And anyway, they used it still, the UN used it, and they used that model, and then they further adjusted it to come up with a number of what our mortality rate is. Now, firstly, there's a big problem with that in its own right. But even after you take their data, okay, this is where it gets really funny. Even if I took their data, and I've written about this in this Times of India editorial, even if we take their distorted data and you have to divide it by population in order to get the per capita number, then also we actually don't do as bad as many countries like the US and Germany, various European countries that were hit heavily by COVID, or Peru and these countries. But in none of those countries has life expectancy been adjusted back down so sharply. Methodology entirely allow for all their biases, you still cannot come up with our life expectancy at birth. And I put this up. I sent this up to the UNDP who collates this and asked for an answer to explain how they have. They haven't still answered our question, so we'll see.
This is actually mind-boggling that somebody would actually use that. I remember the COVID deaths and saga. At that time, I had read all these reports that were calculating the COVID deaths. I mean, seriously, it was nothing short of insane what was happening under the garb of COVID deaths. Like, I was following the Mumbai numbers like a hawk every single day, and it was insane. I even wrote about it myself to counter the whole COVID deaths thing. But yeah, it is what it is. So I want to take a few questions because I know we have to wrap up in like 10-15 minutes. So the entire viewership is like, most of them are like, okay, how does India as a nation now, not just so the government will respond in its own way, and so what, how does an average citizen deal with this? Because we live in a global world, right? So actually 2-3 people have asked this question, like, when I go outside India, or how do we respond to such accusations when they are hurled at us using these indices without getting excited in a calm manner?
So first of all, the thing that I'm trying to do is to make you aware of how biased they are and how absurd they are. Because otherwise, you will know that there's something wrong about them, but there's no answer you have. So first of all, we wrote it down at the Prime Minister's Economic Council, put it down on paper and published it. It's one thing to come out here in Kushal Mehra show or wherever else and talk about it, unless you've got it in a place which can be properly quoted by other writers. So you have to publish it properly. So that's basically the first thing we did. put it in a working paper, properly formatted with all the links and references, etc. Anybody who doesn't agree with us is very welcome to go and check up what it is and write their counter if they think so, or they can build on this if they agree with it and write other papers. So put it down, read these papers, and understand what the issues are. So that's the first step. The second thing is we have got to get Indian think tanks to begin to produce indices. This is an important thing. You see, for far too long, we have always been allowing the rest of the world, particularly the West, to give us certification. And they, of course, extract a rent for that certification. Now, unless we begin to go and turn our gaze on the rest of the world and begin to punch our own weight. I mean, VDEM is it's a think tank from Sweden. Sweden is a non-country. I mean, it's tiny. Its economic weight, its social weight, its political weight is nothing. And yet they have the confidence to go around the world and, certify the rest of the world, give them Nobel Prizes. So clearly they punch above their weight by doing certain kinds of activity. Now we, as a country, we'll come to the government later, but as a country, we now need to begin to get the confidence to go out there. We seem to crave certification from the rest of the world. Like we send a official entry to Oscars. Why? I mean, does the US send an official entry to our IFA awards? No. So this is an important part of the approach that we've got to have, that we've got to be willing to go out there and turn our gaze at the world and dissect them. And I'm at least for a while, I could see that Wyon and particularly Palki used to do this. And I thought that was a very successful effort. But we need to do it as a country. Not individual efforts are good, but we need to be willing to dissect the rest of the world, turn our gaze on the rest of the world, and be willing to give opinions on it. We are the world's fifth largest economy by dollar value, third largest economy by PPP terms. We will, even in dollar terms, soon be the third largest economy. We are the world's largest population, or there almost will be very soon. We need to be confident enough to, issue opinions on the state of the world. And the good news is that in very recent times, we have begun doing that. And you see that with External Affairs Minister Jaishankar finally, making clear pushback and, putting our view in front very clearly and succinctly, without preaching, by the way, without being preachy. We need to be willing to sort of understand and dissect the rest of the world in our own terms. I mean, for example, the Canadians had an opinion on the Indian farmers movement. We should also have an opinion on the truckers' strikes in Canada and the way they were brutally put down using emergency powers. By the way, nothing like that was done in India. Just imagine if India had used similar emergency powers to put down the farmers' agitation. I mean, so I think we need to be, we need to ask questions of the rest of the world, and that's how it is.
Another thing somebody has asked, that there is a pattern when all these indices and rankings are done. So the viewer has asked that they always prepare these questionnaires and they always ask these questions to a certain set of people. These are, self-anointed experts. I don't know what else to say. And always the questions are thrown to them. So does the society and the government then at large have a responsibility to maybe expose the people at large to other sets of intellectuals, then, that okay, these people are also there, they do robust work? Like, how do we counter this? Because they always clearly go to a fixed set of people and they are always going to give a fixed set of answers no matter what the truth
Absolutely.
is.
Unfortunately, this space is taken over by, as I said, a very well-established and entrenched collaborator class, which has been in existence, by the way, from pre-independence period. And many of these people are direct descendants of these collaborator class. So while I don't want to take names, you can guess who they are. And we have some sense of who these people are. Although, as I said, the names are not announced, but we have some sense of who they are. But I think it's I don't think India as a country should be going out there and behaving like a supplicant to these think tanks. The better thing for me, which I think should be done, is for India to ask organizations that give them legitimacy to look at this. So let me illustrate my point. For example, if the legitimacy of indices like VDEM and Freedom Index, etc., comes from the World Bank providing it backing, by including it in the world governance indicators, then it is for us to ask the World Bank why it uses these indicators. Ask the World Bank to go out there and ask these think tanks about their methodology, ask them about the credibility, and ask them for transparency. I don't think we should be, as India, going as supplicants to these think tanks. That's a very bad approach, number one. Number two, as and when we in India and the broader global south begin to produce our own indices in the rest of the world, we should ask that the UN, the World Bank, IMF, etc., include in their basket indices produced by the global south. As I said, this has got to be part of the pushback that we do. And we need to do it as routinely. It's not just a government thing. Of course, some areas, like with the case of international institutions, the government will have to do it. But I think this pushback has got to be a common reflex done by people in general, not just by the government.
Now, a lot of people are also worried about these indices and their second order and third order effects, in the sense of like what economic impact could these indices have in terms of sanctions and other things. So, I mean, your background is economics. So, do you think we these indices in the long run could actually have a more than disproportionate economic impact on us as a nation?
Well, as I said, these indices are used in a fuzzy way. Sometimes, of course, they become concrete things through the routes I mentioned, both the sovereign ratings or other indicators. Yeah, the ESG indicators could also become. But you get beaten down with it in various places. Whether it's trade negotiations or the behavior of NGOs, or and in all kinds of fuzzy areas, you will begin to be influenced by this. So I think the approach we have taken in the past, which is to simply ignore them, was wrong. I think we do need to take them seriously. Very often, these things are, by the way, funded by. We also need to take into account who they funds these things. You will find, for example, there is Soros's Open Society, which is a major funder to many of these think tanks. It's a very common thread through many of the think tanks that you will see. We need to question why a billionaire and a funded a private entity should have so much disproportionate influence in the way the world is run without any democratic accountability of his or own as well. I mean, so since they are making such a fuss about democracy, what is the democratic credentials of George Soros? At least in the case of countries in which he's not a national. Is this not a case of trying to influence and regime change and things like that? I think we need to ask those questions. Then there are many of these indices where they have state funding. Freedom House, for example, 85% of its funding comes from the US government. I do think that we need to have a conversation, not just as a government to government. I think there's to be general conversation of those who care about transparency, about how these opinions are reached.
All right, one last question and we'll wrap it up. So someone has said, Sanjeev sir, there are genuine rankings as well regarding corruption, development, treatment of religious minorities, and how journalists are treated. Do you think they can be considered in the long run, or maybe we have to build all these things from our own end and we start looking at the world from our prism, and that's the only long-term solution?
Absolutely. We need to do this. We need to look at the world from our prism. And this is a major problem in the way, generally speaking, this is not just in the case of indices, this is a general problem. Unfortunately, I think we, as a country who we've been ruled for so long by foreigners and then later by foreign ideologies, that we don't seem to have the confidence in dissecting the rest of the world. And this is not just true of these indices. We do this. We have this problem with everything. So if we, for example, have an award for something, we need some foreign guy to come and become the chairman of that, say, as happened with the movie awards recently. We don't seem to have the confidence of doing it ourselves for some reason. Similarly, if we read our history books, okay, you will hear that Huang Sang said something, and Megasthenes said something, and Fahian said something, and Schliemann said something, and so and so French traveler Tavernier said something. Hello, what about what we said about ourselves? And you, in fact, never hear about what we said about the rest of the world. I mean, at least maybe you will include what is there. When Indians were traveling around the world too, and we had opinions about the rest of the world. Where are our opinions about the rest of the world in any of the conversation? So I think we need to have this. We need to be confident about turning our eyes on the West. Now, I think a generation is coming up that is, whether it's through social media and the Google, or through actually having traveled abroad or studied abroad, we have now seen the rest of the world. I mean, I have lived a very large part of my life abroad. My post graduation was done in Oxford, one of the best universities in the world. I then spent many years living in other countries, like including particularly in Singapore, but traveling and working for working for Europe's largest bank for many years at senior positions. I've seen the rest of the world. I have actually a fairly good feel of what the rest of the world is about, and I think that class of people is growing. And my age group, maybe it will still be a relatively small number, but I think by the time you're looking at people in their late 20s and 30s, there is a sizable number who have studied abroad, come back, or continue to live abroad, who work for international agencies and companies, who have traveled extensively. I think this lack of confidence about turning our gaze on the rest of the world is slowly going to be eroded away. I think the time, therefore, has come when we begin to write about the rest of the world. It's about time, for example, if William Dalrymple can come and write about India and sort of slightly mocking sort of way. I think we should have Indians going abroad and writing. Where is our equivalent, traveling around the US or the UK and writing about them?
I couldn't agree more. And I think that is the only long term solution where I think eventually we as a nation have to look beyond this. First of all, it was amazing that at least somebody wrote a working paper on these three indices. And so before we wrap it up, Sanjeev, can we expect more such papers from you now, looking at these different ratings and breaking them down?
Look, there is a limitation to how much I personally can do. And this is one part of many, many other things I do. So, there is a limit to how much I personally, what we need to do is that the wider intellectual class, whether it is Indian think tanks, Indian academia, and maybe even general citizens, I don't know, people who are interested in these kinds of topics now need to stand up and begin writing these things and have the confidence of taking these things on. There's nothing very deep in it. This took me a few weeks of hard work. I agree. Akanksha and I poured through all of this, but much of this material, ironically, is just available right there. I mean, uh, it's, as I said, this is not an area I normally work in, but even then, it required a few weeks of Google and hunting around and understanding the kind of language they use. And I was able to put out this paper. It's now been out for a couple of weeks. I haven't yet seen anybody coming out with any sensible retort to any point I have made, suggesting to me that it's very likely that I have it right. We wrote to many of these agencies in some cases, including in the case of the HDI case. We wrote to the UNDP and so on, and we asked for answers. And so we have included what we think is a genuinely clear exposition of the topic. It's not, I don't think there are any major errors in our paper, and nobody has pointed out any so far anyway. Therefore, I don't think this is some sort of impossible task. There must be many people listening in here who are capable of, if they're willing to put in a little bit of effort, take another index somewhere in there. Today, there's one that came out on press freedom, or there was one on academic freedom that came out 2 weeks ago. Take them on, dig in, find out what's going on. How did they come up with this? Very often, the questionnaires are already there. The methodologies are there. Take them on. Don't rely on me to be digging through all of them. I just don't have the mind space to keep digging in this. I made an illustrative case. Hopefully, some effort, some degree, I have managed to gain converts. But don't think that the government is the only sort of engine of change. India's wider intellectual class has to rise to the challenge.
I couldn't agree more, and that's why the French press freedom index was something Abhijit and I did personally go through, and we broke down the whole thing. And I agree, we need to do more and more of this. It was an absolute pleasure to finally have you on the podcast, Sanjeev. And here's wishing that there will be many more such conversations, and really looking forward to your next book too, because I always read your books.
Yes, my next book is out in about a month's time. It's on revolutionary movement. The book is called Revolutionary: The Other Story of How India Won Its Freedom.
Awesome, awesome. Really looking forward to that. Or मैं वो book पढ़ के then I'll call you again and then we'll discuss the book. So once again, Sanjeev, thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, Kushal, and see you soon.
All right, guys, we'll wrap today's podcast up. So before we wrap it up, once again, in the description of the podcast, there is a link to download this working paper. I would encourage each and every one of you, click the link, download the paper, read it, take excerpts out of it, cite it in your blogs or in your shorts on YouTube or wherever you do this. That's how you create what I call citation loops. Cite the paper freely everywhere. It's there. The download link is there, so please download it. The rest, you know the drill. Please follow me on YouTube or Spotify, or support the Cārvāka podcast on Fanmo or Patreon. I'll see you guys next time. Until then, namaste. Take care. Bye bye.